Hey guys, this is a Forex price action trading course. This is lesson number 11, using trend lines to gauge the market bias. Okay, let's get going. Alright, here's a lesson overview. First, I'll be explaining how to measure the opposing future strength of a trend line. So in this section, I'll be explaining the basic components that is required to measure the opposing future strength of a trend line. And then I'll go on to explain measuring organic opposing strength with trend lines. So in this section, we're going to use what we learned in the prior section to figure out just the basic strength of a given trend line. And then in the last section, I'll go on to explain measuring opposing strength taking into consideration the prior move strength. Okay, so in this final section, just like we did in lesson 1 of this course, we're going to further define the opposing strength of a trend line by taking into consideration the prior move's strength. Okay. Alright, the 3 indicators to measure the opposing future strength of a trend line. Alright, so let's go on to number 1, the time frame. So the higher the time frame of a trend line, the stronger it is. Okay? So the higher the time frame of the trend line, the stronger it is. So for example, let's draw this trend line from this pivot to this pivot right here. 3 touches, it's legitimate. So this monthly trend line, given that all things remain equal, has more future strength down than any of the lower time frames. So for example, let's go down to the weekly chart. So a trend line on the weekly chart, roughly from the same pivot, for example, this pivot to this pivot right here, has less opposing future strength down than the trend line roughly drawn from the same pivot on the monthly chart. And this relationship holds true all the way down to the tick chart. Okay, so at a basic level, the higher the time frame's trend line, the stronger it is. Okay, let's go on to the remainder of that text. Okay. So if you find a higher time frame's trend line at a pivot, there's no need to look for trend lines on the lower time frames. Alright. So for example, on this weekly chart, we found a trend line from this general pivot right here. Okay, 3 touches. Now if we find a trend line on the higher time frames, generally from the same pivot, then there is no need to take into account this weekly trend line to measure the future strength of a given pivot. Okay, so like I showed you earlier, on the monthly chart, there exists a trend line roughly from the same pivot. So let's go over to the monthly chart. Okay, so here's that trend line on the monthly chart from this pivot to this pivot right here. So hypothetically, if price does reach all the way up to this trend line level, and we wanted to gauge the future short strength of this trend line, since there's a monthly trend line already in this general pivot, there's no need to look to the lower time frames to gauge the future opposing short strength if price reaches this price level. And that's for the reason that the higher time frames are by its very nature stronger than the lower ones. Okay, so let's go on to number 2. Okay, number 2, the number of trend lines. So the more trend lines, the stronger. However, there is a caveat. The trend lines must be made from obviously different pivots. Okay, so let's go ahead and draw one trend line. So it's this pivot to this pivot right here. Now, if price hypothetically reaches this price level where this trend line is, let's say that this trend line by itself generates plus 5 future short strength. But what if there are other trend lines at this general price level? So for example, this trend line from this pivot to this pivot right here. So let's say price rises. And after it rises, it respects both of these trend lines with a very high wick like this. Well, in this case, since price touched 2 trend lines simultaneously, we must add more future short strength to take account for this other trend line. So for example, if this trend line had a future short strength of say plus 5 also, then the culminated future short strength of this price level would actually be plus 10 future short strength. because we added the future short strength of this first trend line and also the second trend line. And furthermore, if another trend line was at that price level, so for example, this trend line from this pivot to this pivot right here, and since this hypothetical candle wick touched all three of these trend lines simultaneously, we're going to have to add the future short strength of this trend line into the equation also. So let's give this a +5 also. So in total, the future short strength that's generated at this price level was actually +15 future short strength. And this could keep going on forever. You could have 4 trend lines, 5, 6 trend lines. Okay, so that's another basic rule. Let's go on to the last rule. All right, so finally, the amount of tests. So the more price tests on the trend line, the stronger it is. Okay, so let's get that trend line we were using from this pivot to this pivot right here. Okay, so if you recall, what we learned in lesson 5 is that in order for a trend line to be legitimate, there must be at least 3 touches on it. So there's 1, 2, and 3. So from this point on into the future, this trend line is a legitimate trend line. In other words, it does generate opposing future short strength. Okay, so since this trend line only had 3 touches on it, which is the bare minimum to be a legitimate trend line, let's give the future short strength of this trend line to be, let's say, +5. However, hypothetically, if price tests this trend line many more times, like this, before current price reaches this trend line, every single one of these touches further increase the future short strength of this trend line. So in this hypothetical situation, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 touches. So if there were actually 6 touches on this trend line, this trend line would actually have a future short strength of +10 future short strength. And this could go on forever. The more tests of a trend line, the stronger the trend line gets. Okay, so now that we know how to gauge the future short strength of a trend line, let's go on to how to measure the organic future short strength of a trend line. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. All right, measuring organic future strength. Okay, so let's go to number 1. The measurement of a monthly pivot strength does not have to take into account the lower time frames. All right, so we did this earlier. So if there's a trend line on a monthly chart, let's say, this one right here, and if we go on to the lower time frame, say the weekly chart, and find another trend line that is generally driven from the same pivot, then we do not have to take into account that weekly trend line strength, simply for the reason that this higher time frames trend line is by its very nature stronger. All right, let's go on to the remainder of that text. Okay, but if examining a weekly intraday pivot, then we must take into account the monthly trend lines. All right, so let me show you what that's about. Okay, so on this monthly chart, say we wanted to measure the future short strength at this price level right here. However, there's no obvious pivots here since this is a monthly chart. So we're going to boil down to the weekly chart, right? So let's go there. All right, so on the weekly chart, there is a pivot at that monthly price level we're talking about. Now in this case, since we're measuring a weekly pivot's future short strength, we must take into account the monthly chart's future short strength at this price level. Okay, so let's go see if there's any trend lines on the monthly chart at this price level. All right, again, that intraday pivot being right here. Let's see if there's any trend lines on the monthly chart that come into play at this price level. And immediately, we could see this trend line from this pivot to this pivot. 3 touches, right? So it's legitimate. All right, so since there's a monthly trend line at this price level, even though we're looking for a weekly pivot's future short strength, we must use this monthly chart's trend line to gauge the future strength down on that weekly chart. And again, it's simply for the reason that the higher time frames trend lines are by its very nature stronger than the trend lines on the lower time frames. Okay, so let's go on to number 2. Okay, number 2. So let's go ahead and find a pivot that we want to measure the future strength of. Alright, in this demonstration, we're just going to use the monthly chart just for simplicity's sake. So let's go ahead and measure the future short strength of this monthly pivot right here. Okay, let's go on to number 3. Okay, find trend lines according to the rules stated in lesson 5 on how to draw trend lines that touched the price level of the pivot in question. Alright, so let's go ahead and look for trend lines that actually come in contact with this pivot right here. Okay, so the most obvious one is this one, from this pivot to this pivot up here. Okay, there's 3 touches on it, so it's legitimate. And let's look for other ones that come from obvious different pivots, right? So this entire area right here is already covered by this pivot, so let's keep going up. Okay, so for this pivot, there's actually only one trend line that's coming in contact with it on this monthly chart. So let's go on to number 4. Alright, number 4. Refer to the 3 indicators list to measure the opposing future strength. Okay, so let's go back to that indicator list. Alright, number 1, the time frame. So remember, the higher the time frame of a trend line, the stronger it is. So if you find a higher time frames trend line at a pivot, there's no need to look for trend lines on the lower time frames. Okay, so in this case, since we're gauging the future strength of a monthly pivot right here, there's no need to go to the lower time frames to look for trend lines to measure this monthly pivot's future short strength. Okay, so let's go on to number 2. Okay, the number of trend lines. So the more trend lines, the stronger. And the caveat is the trend lines must be made from obviously different pivots. Okay, so in this case, we had this trend line from this pivot to this pivot that's coming in contact with that pivot in question. And like we did earlier, we found that there are no other trend lines from obviously different pivots that come in contact with this pivot in question. So again, it's important to remember that caveat that the trend lines must be drawn from obviously different pivots. Obvious different pivots are these areas right here, right? This entire area right here is not an obviously different pivot. So for example, let's say this wick right here was a little bit higher, in which case we will be able to draw a trend line from this pivot to this pivot, and it does come in contact with the pivot in question. However, this does not increase the future short strength of this pivot because both of these trend lines are drawn from the general same pivot area. Okay, so in this scenario, there was only one trend line that comes in contact with that pivot in question, and it's right here. This pivot to this pivot right here. Okay, so let's go on to number 3. Alright, the amount of tests. So the more price tests on the trend line, the stronger. So this trend line that we're using from this pivot to this pivot right here, it has 4 touches on it. So there's 1, 2, 3, and 4. Now, if you recall, what we learned in lesson 5 is that a trend line, at the bare minimum, must have 3 touches on it for it to be legitimate. So if there's 1, 2, 3 touches on it, only after this 3rd touch will this trend line begin to generate future short strength. So after this 3rd touch, if price came up and touched it, well, that generates future short strength. So in this case, since there are only 4 touches on this trend line only has the bare minimum future short strength. So we'll give it a score of, say, +5 future short strength. Okay, so after going through the 3 indicator list, we found that the organic future short strength caused from this trend line on this pivot right here was actually +5 future short strength. Okay, so now let's further define this future short strength right here by measuring the prior move's future long strength and deduct this from this number right here to get the true future short strength of this monthly pivot right here. Okay, let's go up some slides. So deducting the prior move's strength. Number 1, find the major pivot that comes prior to the pivot in which you are examining the future strength for on the same time frame. Okay. So if we're examining the future short strength of this pivot right here, we also want to know the future long strength of the prior major pivot, which is right here. Now, major pivots can be briefly explained as the last point in which price made an obvious turn from long to short or short to long. So in this case, that would be this pivot, this pivot, this pivot, this pivot, this pivot, and so on, because these are all obvious points in which price obviously changed direction. Okay, so in this case, we're going to examine the future long strength of this prior major pivot right here. Okay, number 2, measure the organic future strength of the prior major pivot's move. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and find all the trend lines that came in contact to that prior major pivot, and then use the 3 indicator list to measure its future strength long. Okay, so we'll just zoom out for this one because there's more pivots behind here. All right, the first trend line is this one from this pivot to this pivot right here. Extend that into the future. And then we have another trend line from this pivot to this pivot right here. Okay, let's recall that this pivot is obviously different from this pivot. So in this case, both of these trend lines can be used to gauge the future strength of the same pivot right here. Okay, so let's go through that 3 indicator list again. Okay, so we'll go through the 3 indicators. The first one is time frame. Okay, the higher the time frame of a trend line, the stronger it is. So if you find a higher time frame's trend line at a pivot, there's no need to look for trend lines on the lower time frames. So in this case, since we're using the monthly chart, which is the highest time frame that I am using, there's no need to look to the lower time frame's trend lines to gauge the future strength long of that monthly pivot. So let's go on to number 2. The number of trend lines. The more trend lines, the stronger. The caveat is, the trend lines must be made from obviously different pivots. Okay, so like I mentioned earlier, both these trend lines are from obviously different pivots, thus we could use them to gauge the future strength long of this pivot right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and give both of these trend lines a score. We'll give this trend line right here a +5. Then we'll give this one right here a +5 also. Okay, let's go on to number 3. Okay, number 3, the amount of tests. So the more price tests on the trend line, the stronger. So let's go ahead and count how many tests there are on those trend lines. Okay, so this trend line right here has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 7 tests. All right, so since there's 7 tests on this trend line right here, let's upgrade this score by, say, +3. Now let's count the tests on the other trend line. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, so that's less than 7, but it still does add a little bit of strength. So let's give that, say, a +1. Okay, so we have a total future long strength for this trend line of +8 right here. Then a total of +6 for this next trend line right here. So in total, we got a future long strength of this pivot right here of +14 future long strength. Okay, so now that we gauge the future long strength of the prior major pivot's move, let's go back to the original slide. Okay, up 2 slides. Okay, number 3. Deduct the prior move's strength from the future strength of the original pivot in question. All right, so if you recall, the organic future short strength of this monthly pivot right here was +5 future short strength. However, we found that the prior move's last major pivot actually had a +14 future long strength. So in order to get the true future short strength of this pivot right here, we have to deduct 14 from 5, which gives us a -9. Okay, so after we examined all elements, we consequently found that this monthly pivot right here had a future short strength of -9, which means if we only use trend lines to gauge the market bias, if this pivot right here only had a future short strength of -9, given that the break even or zero level will be right here, because this is where we calculated the future short strength, there should actually still be a +9 future long strength left in this move starting from the zero line. Now obviously there's other price elements that we have to gauge in accordance with trend lines, like price patterns and gaps. However, if it was only trend lines that we were using to gauge the market bias, then as price pulls back as it is right now, a trader should be long biased, at least up to the zero line level. Furthermore, a distance of +9 beyond that zero level. Okay, so this is the basic way in which trend lines can be used to gauge the market bias. And if this concept is still a little confusing to you, don't worry, because we'll be doing a lot of examples in future lessons. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so that was it for this lesson. Again, please don't hesitate to ask questions in the comments section, because I know the lessons are getting a little bit more complicated than earlier lessons. Okay, so in the next lesson, we'll go over how to use head and shoulder patterns to gauge the market bias. So just like we did in this lesson with trend lines, we're now going to use head and shoulder patterns to know whether we should be long or short bias in the market. Okay, so I hope you guys have a great rest of the day, guys. And thanks for watching. Okay, bye.